Edward II reigned as King of England from 1307 to 1327. His reign was characterized by a series of military defeats, political turmoil, and his eventual deposition by his wife and his barons. Edward's inability to effectively manage his kingdom, coupled with his personal weaknesses and contentious relationships with powerful factions, led to his downfall and the eventual deposition in 1327. Despite his good intentions, his reign left the English monarchy in a fragile state, setting the stage for instability and civil war in the coming decades. Edward's reign is often seen as a stark contrast to that of his father, Edward I, whose reign had been marked by military victories, legal reforms, and the consolidation of royal power. Edward II struggled with the challenges of leadership and governance, facing resistance from the barons, military defeats in Scotland, and personal conflicts that ultimately undermined his rule. His relationships with various factions, particularly the barons and the church, would shape the trajectory of his reign and contribute to the eventual collapse of his monarchy. Edward II was born on April 25, 1284, to Edward I and Eleanor of Castile, and he was the second son of the king. He was not initially expected to inherit the throne, as his elder brother, Alfonso, was the heir apparent. However, Alfonso's premature death in 1284 left Edward as the new heir to the throne. Edward's early years were marked by the absence of his father, who was often engaged in military campaigns, including the wars in Wales and Scotland. As a result, Edward's upbringing was relatively isolated, and he did not receive the same level of training in governance and warfare that his father had. Edward's relationship with his father, Edward I, was complex. While he was deeply devoted to his father, he was also criticized for his perceived lack of military ability and for his reluctance to engage in the rigorous and often brutal demands of kingship. Edward I, a formidable king, known for his military successes and strong leadership, was reportedly disappointed by his son's apparent lack of aptitude for rule. Nevertheless, when Edward I died in 1307, Edward II ascended to the throne at the age of 23. At the time of Edward II's accession, England was in a relatively stable condition. However, the death of Edward I left behind a legacy of high expectations. Edward II's reign began with the promise of continuity, but his inability to meet these expectations would quickly become apparent. From the outset of his reign, Edward II faced significant challenges in consolidating his authority. One of the most immediate concerns was his relationship with the barons, many of whom were powerful landholders who held considerable sway over English politics. Edward's early reign was marked by his reliance on a group of favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston, a young knight from Gascony, whom Edward had known since his youth. Gaveston became one of Edward's closest confidants and was appointed to key positions of power in the royal court, which deeply angered the English barons. The barons, who were already wary of the influence of foreign advisers in the royal court, saw Gaveston's rise as a sign of Edward's failure to recognize their own authority and influence. This led to widespread resentment among the nobility. In 1308, a group of barons demanded that Gaveston be exiled from England. Edward initially resisted, but eventually, under pressure from the barons, he was forced to comply and banish Gaveston. However, Edward's devotion to Gaveston was not easily broken. After Gaveston's exile, Edward eventually recalled him to England in 1312, a move that reignited the conflict between the king and the barons. In 1312, the barons, led by the Earl of Lancaster, captured Gaveston, and after a brief trial, he was executed. This event marked the beginning of a long period of conflict between Edward II and the baronial opposition. Another major challenge Edward II faced during his reign was the ongoing conflict with Scotland. His father, Edward I, had fought multiple wars in an attempt to assert English dominance over Scotland. But by the time Edward II became king, Scotland had regained much of its independence under the leadership of Robert the Bruce, who had secured a series of victories against English forces. Edward II's early military campaigns in Scotland were disastrous. In 1314, the English forces suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce decisively defeated an army led by Edward II's forces. The battle was a major blow to Edward's reputation and authority, and it effectively ended English attempts to control Scotland for the time being. The defeat at Bannockburn left Edward II deeply embarrassed and further fueled his political opposition at home. Despite the Scottish setback, Edward II remained committed to reclaiming English control over Scotland. He launched a series of campaigns, but none were successful in achieving lasting victories. The cost of these campaigns, both in terms of resources and manpower, further strained the relationship between the monarchy and the barons. Edward's inability to deliver a decisive victory in Scotland became a central criticism of his reign and contributed to the growing discontent among his subjects. Edward II's relationship with the barons continued to deteriorate throughout his reign. His reliance on favourites, such as Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger, alienated many of the barons, who saw the king's favouritism as a threat to their own power. Despenser, who had risen to prominence in the royal court, became one of Edward's most trusted advisers, and like Gaveston, Despenser was loathed by the nobility. The barons, led by figures such as Thomas of Lancaster and the Archbishop of Canterbury, became increasingly hostile toward the king's rule. By 1321, open conflict broke out between the king and a faction of powerful barons who formed the Ordinance to limit the king's power and reduce the influence of his favourites. Edward was forced to accept a series of reforms, known as the Ordinances of 1311, which placed restrictions on his ability to make appointments and imposed financial limitations on his rule. Despite these concessions, Edward II's reign remained mired in conflict. The barons, particularly Lancaster, continued to challenge the king's authority, and by 1322, open warfare broke out between Edward and the rebellious barons. Edward was able to defeat the barons in the Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322. But the victory did little to resolve the underlying tensions. Edward's reliance on Despenser, combined with his continued alienation of powerful nobles, meant that his rule remained fragile and unstable. Edward II's reign reached its tragic conclusion in 1326. By this time, his queen, Isabella of France, had become increasingly dissatisfied with her husband's rule. Isabella, who had married Edward in 1308, was frustrated by his weakness and his failure to manage both the kingdom and their relationship. In 1325, Isabella travelled to France on diplomatic business, where she became involved in a romantic relationship with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English nobleman who had been exiled after the rebellion of the barons. Together, Isabella and Mortimer decided to overthrow Edward II and take control of the English throne. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer launched an invasion of England with the support of disgruntled barons. Edward's forces were quickly overwhelmed, and the king was forced to flee. He was captured in November 1326 and imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. In January 1327, Edward II was formally deposed by the English Parliament. His young son, Edward III, was declared king, and Mortimer and Isabella effectively took control of the government. Edward II's deposition marked the end of his reign and the beginning of a period of instability for the English monarchy. The exact circumstances of Edward II's death remain a subject of speculation and mystery. It is generally believed that he was murdered in prison, with some historians suggesting that he was suffocated with a red-hot poker, although the true details of his death remain unclear. Edward II's reign is remembered as one of the most tragic and troubled periods in English history. His failure to manage the political factions in his kingdom, his disastrous military campaigns, and his reliance on unpopular favorites all contributed to the eventual collapse of his rule. His deposition and death set the stage for a period of instability in England, as the young Edward III ascended to the throne and the influence of figures like Mortimer and Isabella continued to shape the politics of the kingdom. Despite his shortcomings, Edward II's reign did have some lasting consequences. The challenges he faced helped to shape the future development of the English monarchy, and his deposition ultimately contributed to the evolution of parliamentary power and the growing importance of the barons in English governance.